Today we are going to talk about the properties of real numbers. We are going to define for you what each property is, and we're going to help you to understand how to identify each property when it is given to you. The first property that we will discuss today is the commutative property of addition. The commutative property of addition allows us to switch the order of two terms when they are separated by addition. In the two examples that we have given to you, 2 plus 3 is the same thing as 3 plus 2, just as x plus 1 is the same as 1 plus x. The commutative property of addition allows us to switch the order when we have two terms, and it does not change the value on either side of the equal sign. Next is the commutative property of multiplication. The commutative property of multiplication is very similar to the commutative property of addition. The only difference is we are now looking at the operation of multiplication. The numbers are separated by multiplication and can be just switched in order. In other words, 2 times 3 is the same thing as 3 times 2, just as 4 times x would be the same thing as x times 4. That is the commutative property of multiplication. Next is the associative property of addition. The associative property of addition, you will notice in our example, contains 3 terms on each side of the equal sign. This property allows us just to regroup numbers when the operation is addition. So you will notice in the example, 3 plus 2 is in parentheses, plus 5. On the right side, we have the same exact order. However, we have regrouped the 2 and the 5 together and left the 3 out. This is still giving us the same value on both sides, thus the associative property of addition. The associative property of multiplication is also very similar to the associative property of addition. You will notice that in this case now we are looking at multiplication as opposed to addition. The order does not change. We have 3 terms on each side. So you will notice on the left side 2 times 3 in parentheses times 4 is the same thing as 2 times 3 times 4 with the 3 and the 4 in the parentheses. This is the associative property of multiplication. The next 2 properties that we're going to look at are the identity properties. When you're thinking about the identity properties, think about what we are going to add or multiply times the number to keep the number the same. In other words, to keep the number's identity. In the addition identity property, we are going to add 0 to any number to keep it the same. So thus in our example, 3 plus 0 equals 3. For multiplication, in our example here, to keep the number the same, we are going to multiply by 1. Therefore, in our example, 4 times 1 equals 4. These are the identity properties of both addition and multiplication. The next property we're going to talk about is the inverse property of addition. Or another way of saying that is the additive inverse. Basically what we're talking about here is we're talking about the opposite of a number. In other words, if we add -3 to 3, we are going to get 0. Similarly, if we have the number -5, we would add the number 5 to get 0. This is the additive inverse property. Next is the inverse property of multiplication, or the multiplicative inverse. As we look at this property, what we are looking for is we are looking for 2 numbers that multiply together to equal 1. In the first example, 3 times 1/3 equals 1. You will notice the second number is basically the reciprocal. In the second example, 1 over x times x also gives us 1. Again, the first and the second numbers are reciprocals of each other. This is the inverse property of multiplication. The next property we're going to talk about is the distributive property. The distributive property is a property that we use quite a bit throughout our algebra careers. As we look at this, the distributive property allows us to eliminate parentheses. You will notice in the first example, 2 times x plus 3 in parentheses. Basically, we are going to distribute the 2 and multiply it times both terms in the parentheses. In other words, 2 times x is 2x and 2 times 3 is 6, thus giving us 2x plus 6 on the right side. As you look at the second example, we're going to distribute the x, so it becomes xy plus xz. This is the distributive property. The last property that we are going to discuss is the multiplication property of 0. This is probably the easiest property to remember, just because it has 0 in the title. Basically what it says is if we multiply a number by 0, we are going to get 0. In the example, 6 times 0 equals 0. This is the multiplication property of 0. Now let's do a little review, and you do a little bit of practice on your own. Take a look at these 5 properties and examples and see if you can identify the properties. Do this on your own, pause the video, then press play, and you can check out your answers and see how well you understand this material. Now take a few minutes and check your answers to the 5 review practice problems that related to properties of real numbers. This concludes our lesson on properties of real numbers. Just a reminder to you, be sure to write at least one example of each property in your notes. Remember, as you continue to work in ALEKS, you may use your notebook as you do your assessment. That would be very helpful on this topic.